Hello and welcome to Pandoradom. I am your host, Miles Gray. Unfortunately, my co-host, Paul Creel, was not able to make it today as there is some very loud church music going down, it would seem, on their block in the Philippines. Uh, I, on the other hand, am here and around for the moment anyway, and there is much going on indeed in the world, personally, and in the universe. Now, there are many things that I would like to discuss. There's always a plethora of things to say, some very critical. But alas, we are limited by our means. As human beings, we speak telescopically. That is to say, that when I communicate with you orally in this manner, I string words together telescopically, one after the other, sequentially. I can't really escape the sequentiality of stringing words together to make sentences as I am here and now, right before you as I speak, which I often marvel at that very idea that on the one hand, there's so much that you want to communicate to the person with whom you're speaking or to your audience in general, and they to you, presumably. And it seems like this exploding ball of willed communication and connecting to the other of I and thou. That's, of course, a reference to Martin Buber. So, and yet, though, we are restricted by speaking telescopically one word after the other. I can't speak 15 words in a single breath. Or no, that I could technically. Well, could I? Could you say 15 words in a single breath? That's an interesting question. I suppose it might depend on a number of factors. But what I mean to say rather is that I cannot say 15 words simultaneously with my own single voice unassisted. Now, if I had a 4-track times several, I might be able to do that. Now, that's very dated, of course. I can just use any old computer software today with multi-tracks. But what I mean is, in general, I can't speak, masses of words at once. I can only speak one word at a time, one sound at a time, in fact, one phoneme at a time. So if I say the word fellowship, not only am I saying the word fellowship telescopically with all the other words around it, but I'm also saying fellowship as in, according to the phonemes, hegyanim, which is, fe, le. Well, you have a consonant fe, a vowel e, le, o, sh, I, p, fellowship. And so I'm transmitting these separate sounds to you one by one, relatively quickly, admittedly, but nonetheless telescopically. And so you're receiving them bit by bit in sequential order. If I mix them up and say shipfellow, for example, or something even more silly, well, shipfellow is not so silly, but I mean, if I were to say ipsh, elof, for example, which would be a rearrangement of those sounds, it would be meaningless. I mean, you wouldn't be able to understand that I was saying fellowship. So it has to be in a particular sequence. Now, I can imagine theoretical languages where it doesn't matter how you rearrange the letters within a word. Just like many languages have essentially free word order or free syntax, where you can basically put the words in any order in the sentence and it will still have the same meaning. Now, in English, you can't do that, of course, but in some languages you can. But imagine you could do that with a single word according to letters or phonemes, that is to say, the sounds within the word, the sounds of the letters within the word, that is. Not always, it doesn't always correspond to the letters. I mean, of course, we know from English that you have crazy words like, rough. I mean, GH does not exactly correspond to the F sound usually. Um, so so yeah, it depends. Not always one to one, of course. So what I'm saying though is I can imagine a theoretical language where you could rearrange the letters within a given word in any form, and it would still have the same meaning. I mean, that would be an interesting constructed language if you've ever heard of conlangs before, which is it's a whole community really of people who like to make up their own languages, their own artificial languages. There are some famous examples like Klingon is probably one of the more famous, and there's Lojban. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. There is Tokipona. Um, there are quite a number, quite a number. And I kind of created or I dabbled with creating my own language in the past, my own conlang. Uh, I made some progress, but I decided in the end that rather than working on that, I would put my wordsmithing skills to use in poetry and in writing novels in a kind of verse, but a kind of prose. And I think I'm probably better suited to that than conlanging. I think I could probably do it if I really wanted to, but I'm not sure that that's what I do best. I don't know if I write novels or poetry. Rather, that is to say, I don't know if that's what I do best either. But I'm taking a gamble on that because that's what I like doing. I think that that's a big element of it, and you should do what you like as much as possible. That's a hard-earned truth. So, yeah, so I have these thoughts at times about languages. And I was at the greengrocers today and I was buying dates and peppers and lemon and so forth. And I asked about the Asian pear. Where are the Asian pears? Because I really like Asian pears. And I was told that it was an Asian apple or a nashi, which I wasn't clear what a nashi was. And I'm not sure if I'm even pronouncing it correctly. And so I asked if the greengrocer if he could write it down for me, which he found this to be totally bizarre, a request. But he did do it finally, and then I put the nikud. This was in Hebrew, of course, so I put the nikud on the word, that is the special dots that show you how to vocalize it properly. And he was fascinated by this because it's not a normal thing to put the vowel vocalization dots on Hebrew script. Usually you read it without. But so basically, if you're doing it, it means either you're making it easier to read for a child, it's for poetry, or it's for liturgical or religious purposes. Um, but that's in the case that you're reading it. But in the case that you're actually dotting it yourself, you have to have a very specialized knowledge to be able to do it properly. It's a skill unto itself. You have to know the ins and outs of proper Hebrew grammar spanning many millennia, really, of spelling rules and conventions. It takes classes upon classes or extreme autodidactic loyalty to the craft to be able to master it or even to begin to master this system. But as a poet writing in Hebrew, among other languages, I have found it very important to learn, in addition to my poetic excuse me, to also learn how to write, to do my own nikud or to do my own vocalization dots. You could have somebody else do it, but at this point, I'm good enough to be called a professional nakdan or a professional daughter, not a daughter, but a daughter. Uh, but I'm not professional in the sense that I make money from it normally. It's just something it's professional. And I mean, I guess I'm an amateur daughter in a way, but it's what I mean is in terms of skill level. However, that being said, even as something of a professional daughter, there's still so much that's in the air and is ill-defined. There are variations, allowable variations. Anyway, this is the wonderful world of linguistics. I don't know if this is of interest to many people, but the reason that I mention it honestly is because I want to, as the host of Pandoradom, give a sense of who I am personally and what I go through on the daily to give a furthered sense of interest and context about the things that I talk about otherwise. So if we talk about other Pandoric questions, whether it be about medicine, the sciences, history, poetry, philosophy, mathematics, the universe, the multiverse, whatever we end up talking about in the end, uh, the questions that we wish to address and to explore, ultimately to have some context about whom you're having this conversation or with whom you're having this conversation, it's really quite beneficial, I would wager. And part of it is that I'm banking on something that I myself enjoy or appreciate greatly, which is when I watch a show or I, well, that is to say, a show about real topics. I mean, it's less the case perhaps with movies, fictional movies, where you have actors. But what I mean is, podcasts, YouTube channels where you're watching hosts talking about real or imagined events, but it's a person who's not strictly speaking an actor, but a host, or an MC, perhaps you might say, uh, and so that general way of thinking. I mean that it's it really makes me feel more appreciative personally of the content that's being delivered. It's a risk. It can be a risk, honestly, because you're then bringing your personal life perhaps into your professional life or your amateur um, life in terms of your hobbies or interests, insofar as that's shown on YouTube or elsewhere in the public eye, as I am doing now. Now, this is the very thing, though. If you read poetry, and especially after each poem, you see this is a whole thing, I have to say. I mean, I as a young man or a teenager, really, or a young boy, I remember going to my uncle's house and I discovered this book. And for years and years, I didn't know who this poet was. I just remembered reading this book in his house on Montague Avenue in Northwest DC, right next to Rock Creek Park. You just had to go down the embankment and you were in Rock Creek Park. He lived at the right end of the cul-de-sac, down the hill. It's really quite a place. And I was reading this book many years ago, and I remember after each poem, the poet wrote where he was when he wrote it, I believe, or at least it was notated that way. And it said, for example, Sofia, Bulgaria, and then it gave the date. And for years, I wondered who that was. And I thought maybe it was a Bulgarian poet. And I searched and I searched and I searched. And it wasn't until within the last year or two that I was able to discover by various means that, in fact, it was a Turkish poet. And I was given a translation of his work in Hebrew as a gift recently by my wife. And seeing my uncle again after more than 15 years abroad, I walked into that old house where I used to live with him and his girlfriend for quite a while. And he read me one of his communist poems. That is to say, my uncle read one of his. And then he read one of the communist poems of this Turkish poet. Now, you can probably guess if you know anything about Turkish poets about whom I'm speaking. But I finally found out who it was. And I have to say it's very strange because my this very uncle, he passed away uh recently. And I didn't realize that that was going to be the last time that I ever saw him. That he read to me his poems and he read to me the poems of this Turkish communist sitting in his old professor's chair with his pipe. And it's very, very difficult personally beyond that too, because I am a Zionist Jew who lives in Israel. That uncle was an extreme anti-Zionist, extreme. And I now understand more than ever that this had a lot to do with his Marxist and Soviet supporting orientation. I didn't realize this until really with within the last 2 years. I've come to understand so much more about the roots of modern anti-Semitism, and it's being wrapped up with anti-Zionism, especially as created within Soviet agitprop or agitprop, that is to say, propaganda from within the USSR that has recently, well, not so recently, but it's been very prominently featured in overseas anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist sentiment, as we have seen so clearly in Western campuses. But it's mixed, it's not just Soviet propaganda repackaged and imported. It's also, ideas coming out of the Islamist world. Not, I specifically say Islamist, not Islamic, because I don't want to say that it's all Muslims, of course, that have a problem with Jews. But I will say that unfortunately, there is a problem with anti-Semitism within the Muslim world. That's just a fact. On the other hand, if you are a Muslim or a person of any other faith and you have no problem with Jews, then we have no problem. It's as simple as that. And here in Israel, many of us are good friends. Muslims, Christians, Jews, Druze, and many other religions that we have here. And so I speak this with a kind of hard-earned honesty. I know what I'm talking about. Now, it's possible that from where you're sitting, you can't stomach what I have said. I understand why. I understand that it's difficult to hear these things. But if you know, you know. There's a lot to be understood if you really just look and study and learn with earnestness. Earnestness, or I like to say earnesty, but I don't believe that that's a real. I mean, people. I mean, I think it's like I think I may have coined it. I don't know if I coined it. Maybe it does exist, but I say earnesty. I think in parallel to honesty, but I think you're supposed to say earnestness, not earnesty. But I like earnesty. And it reminds me of Ernest. I think that show from back in that movie series of movies, right? But that was another s- different different spelling of Ernest, right? But in any case, I feel like I've lost friends since October 7th, 2023, and what has happened since. The reason I say I feel is because some of them I'm not sure if I've lost them or not. It's just that I haven't heard back from them. So I don't know if it's about that or about something else. And then there are others about whom I'm certain who told me outright horrible, horrible things. Blood libel. And it was shocking. People that I have been friends with for decades, since I was a wee boy, basically a young teenager. And to add insult to injury, these are people who they're not even just Americans. Some of them come from war zones themselves, and they had to deal with horrendous situations in the former Yugoslavia. And I can understand why they would, see the conflict here through that particular lens. But it's a similar mistake that the Irish make frequently. Not all Irish people, but many Irish have a tendency to see the conflict here through the lens of the Troubles and their struggles with the British and so forth. Uh, Not the same thing, not at all. It's a false equivalence. But what the end result is, what the upshot is of this false equivalence followed through with as an ideology, is an incorrect assessment about what Israel is actually doing and what's happening among the cultural Arabs of the Levant in the land of Israel, or in other words, what are sometimes known as Palestinians. Now, the reason I say this in many of my videos, the reason that I say Palestinians with this caveat is because the meaning of the term Palestinians has shifted very greatly over the last few decades. If you go back to prior to the 1960s, Palestinian meant a very different thing. And it even meant a number of different things during that era. But in any case, it didn't apply to the people who are called Palestinians today generally in the same way. That is to say that you had Jewish residents, for example, of the Mandate of Palestine, which was a holding of the British under the British Mandate, and Israelis who were subjects of this empire. I mean, subjects is not the correct, you know what I mean? I guess you could say subjects in a way, but uh well, I don't know, it's not exactly subjects, but you know what I mean. I hope they were also called Palestinians within certain contexts. Um and that makes sense because what they were was in general what you would call British Palestinians, that is to say, citizens or denizens of the British Mandate of Palestine. So that's why I say that. It's not about trying to deprive a people of their peoplehood. It's about questioning the historical reality of certain historical questions. Now, a people have a peoplehood, but it's very important to be accurate about names because everything is in a name. On the other hand, we are also chained to the name. This is another example which, it comes down to convention. There are many people who are unhappy about the term anti-Semitism because they say, well, the Jews are not the only Semites. Anybody else in the Middle East is also a Semite, insofar as they are natively from that region. And then there are others who falsely claim that the Jews are not even Semites, which, that's a whole other conspiracy theory. We are. Uh, all peoples have a certain amount of genetic admixture, but it happens to be that Jews of all varieties, including Ashkenazi Jews, have a majority marker generally for Semitic or Middle Eastern Mediterranean blood. Blood is not quite the term, but you understand. So it's a but the other thing is that that's not what Judaism is about. Judaism is not about who you are genetically. It's about something more, much, much more. However, it happens to be the case for historical reasons that Jews happen to be primarily still characterized by a very ancient lineage, which is traceably Semitic and Levantine. So that's an important thing to be aware of. There's much to discuss. There's so much to discuss, but as I said, I'm trying to give a caption here about myself, and I think my co-host Paul Cradle is interested in doing that for himself as well, and any other guests that we have on the show. And I believe and I hope that you, as a Pandooranauts, would be interested in captioning your life too. That not only do you deliver words of wisdom, words of inquiry, a life of pursuit of something more, but you caption that and you say, not only am I asking these questions, not only am I seeking the void, but I am also saying that these are my humble digs. This is where I come from. This is what I represent. This is who I am. And that's what I was trying to say about the Turkish poet, that at the end of the poems, it said Sofia, Bulgaria, and the date. It profoundly influenced me, just that. And I started doing it in my own poetry. In the book I published, which I now see, it's in the National Library of Israel. There are copies in Japan, America. Some were sent to Bangladesh. However, I believe that they never arrived or they were blocked from getting in, unfortunately. And then what is the other place? I sent another one to, let's see, Japan, let's see, Israel, Japan, the United States, and there's somewhere else I sent one. Where was the other one sent to? The Phil? No, China? I believe there's somewhere else that I sent some copies to be distributed. Anyway, those are the main ones: Japan, America, Israel. But you can probably find copies in other places, floating around, I hope, in, random places. That's the dream. But you could also find it. It's already on Internet Archive. The entire book is already there for the reading, which is okay with me. I mean, it's not about the money. It's about getting my message out there for whoever wants to read it, to experience it, to live it. Now, in my own poetry volume, after each poem, almost not all, but most of them, I put the place and the date where I wrote it, and also a short captionary note about what I was going through, which ends up even turning into a little poem unto itself much of the time, which I was both pleased and upset to understand. But because it's like, what are you doing? This is getting really meta and weird. And I got pushback from other local poets. I hesitate to say local poets because they're of some renown outside of the circle, which I'm barely part of at this point. But anyway, that's another story. This is a guy who helped me to publish one of my major published poems, which was Hayal Shel Medina Hagen, which I published under another name, Amosh Hameshorel, in the past, in Iton 77, which is the newspaper 77 or Journal 77, which is one of the most important literary journals in Israel. And through him, I was able to get my poem, Soldier of the State Defend, which I normally don't necessarily write that kind of material, but I was commissioned to write it. So I submitted it. It was accepted into this major journal. Anyways, that was a big deal because I was really still quite young and I was still burgeoning a poet at the time. But anyway, this same guy who helped me publish that many years down the line, he read this book and he said, I'm not necessarily so much a fan of putting the name, the place and the date and all this captionary material after a poem. I feel like it's cleaner, it's more pristine to have just a standalone poem and not to embaggage it with, all this sort of extraneous, unnecessary material, sort of, verbiage. I don't know. I have mixed feelings. On the one hand, I totally get what he's saying. To have this sort of pristine, clean, unencumbered poem that stands alone. I get it. On the other hand, like I said, I was so deeply influenced and moved, not just by the poems of this Turkish poet, but by the captions underneath the poems. I mean, to me, that was absolutely fabulous and incredible to know where this guy was when he wrote this beautiful poetry, even though I don't necessarily ideologically agree. I don't consider myself to be sort of, I don't know what I would call him, a type of Marxist. Uh, but I believe it was Aristotle, like you can still appreciate without agreeing. So that's what I try to do. I try to enjoy without necessarily agreeing. And that's what I would expect of you, the Pandooranauts, that even if you don't agree with me or with Paul, and we don't even agree with each other much of the time, well, we do often, but there are times when we don't, you can still appreciate. You can still watch. You can still subscribe and like. So, anyway, I digress. So, I just feel like it's kind of amazing and legendary to leave captions, to leave a little epitaph of the moment. That's really what it is for me. It's an epitaph of the moment. That is to say, on the gravestones, when you write a little message, here lies so and so, so and so and so, beloved son, and then, the date, 1917 to 1982. That's an epitaph. So an epitaph of the moment could be a little caption after a poem that you've written and published. It gives an insight, an almost time travel portal or window, a door, Pandoran, into where you actually were when you wrote that poem. And the way that I think of it is, as much as people make fun of this movie, the butterfly effect with Ashton Kutcher. He looked so hard at his journals. He focused on them like this, and it popped him back to where he was, literally, when he wrote that journal entry or around that time. And that movie had a big impact on me, as The Matrix did and many others, Blade Runner. And again, like it doesn't matter how much people make fun of it. It was such a brilliant movie in so many ways. I mean, it really captured something strong, I believe. And it's just something like that when you read a caption under a poem where you learn something about the context in which that poem was composed, penned, put to paper, and given unto posterity, that is like a butterfly effect style, wormholing back to the very moment where that poet, poetess, poet person was when they wrote that. that you are literally almost time traveling through a wormhole. Not literally, but you know what I mean, right? I hope so. Because I'm not speaking silly here, guys. I really mean what I say. It's time travel through the heart, if not through some more scientific means. That's what I'm trying to say. And that very much is the message of Pandoradom, in fact. Is to time travel with your heart, even if we may not have the direct scientific means to do so, to literally time travel. Thank you kindly, my good friends, fellow Pandooranauts, for joining me for this session. I know we talked about a lot of disparate things that are perhaps not so greatly related seeming, but in the way that wormholes are connected to the places that they connect. In fact, but the connections I have exposed are more Nexus-like than you may have supposed. Signing off, Miles Gray, Pandoradom. All right, guys.